Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
I remember when I was in England, all this talk about when certain cities would come to play, they'd have to board up the city. Because these marauding bands of fans would be going through the town, tearing things up and so on.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Ernie Sibley, who is a local businessman and teacher. Father Bacik and Mr. Sibley will discuss sports and fanaticism. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Ernie, I want to talk sports with you a little bit. That's something that we do often. And in doing that, there's always the danger of it becoming sort of esoteric, of talking in language that other people don't understand. I have to go back to the reliance on Carl Rogers' dictum that when I speak most personally, I speak most universally, that if we do indeed tap our experience of interest in sports, of participating and being a spectator, that there's got to be something of more universal quality to it, that there is some larger message that comes out of the world of sports that people can latch on to even though they aren't part of it. It's like listening to Horowitz talk about playing the piano, for example, and the kind of experience he has in doing that, and that learning from that of saying, well, I don't play the piano, but I can appreciate what he's talking about in some way. So I'm hoping our conversation about sports isn't just esoteric, but that it has some sort of broader interest.
Yes, I hope what we're talking about essentially is how sports and being a fan and a participant enables us to learn more about ourselves in relationship with others, also learn about ourselves in groups. What sort of a team player are we, or what sort of a fan are we in large groups? Do I go with the mob in a stadium, or do I retain my personal integrity? A lot of self-knowledge about just how I operate in the world, and I think those learnings are available.
Yeah, and one has to be attentive, therefore, to how we are responding to the world of sports. I mean, it is a very spontaneous world and not given to reflection all that much, and it becomes necessary, it seems like anything else that's absorbing, to step back at times and ask yourself what it means and what does this involvement tell me about myself and even about the culture as a whole. I want to slant this a bit, Ernie, and talk about sports and being a spectator. And as soon as I start talking about that, the word fanaticism comes to my mind.
Absolutely.
That's the word we use as sports fan, but it comes from fanatic, and we immediately see some of the distortions that can come into the world of sports, where people get carried away. We see in the news, for example, the stories of soccer around the world. In England, for example, I remember when I was in England, all this talk about when certain cities would come to play, they'd have to board up the city. Because these marauding bands of fans would be going through the town, tearing things up and so on. We see people getting injured at these games. Where was it in Latin America? Didn't they have to build moats around the soccer field or something to keep people off and from coming onto the field? So there you see, a striking example of what would we say, mass psychology, of getting carried away and really acting in a fanatical way.
Absolutely. I suspect there's some relationship between our fan behavior and our personal level of frustration with our life and our lot in life. It seems like, in terms of economic groups and life experiences, that often it's and I don't want to stereotype the bleachers, but I suspect, for instance, being an auto worker in Cleveland and having been laid off and being jobless for 2 years, and it's easy to feel a lot of personal frustration, anxiety, and have that come out in a group setting. And really the dark side of being a fan, the dark side of being a fanatic comes out, and group behavior gets reduced to the lowest possible denominator. And we do things that we would never do on our own.
That's a good point. You know, what I immediately thought of was Aristotle's notion of catharsis, which he associated with the theater, of course, that when you went to the theater, you were reliving part of your own life, or you were finding a way of sort of taking your raw emotions and discharging them in some way. And I mean, fundamentally saw that in a positive light. This is something that we have to do, that there has to be a way to deal with the dark side. The other thing that comes to my mind is children and fairy tales, and the fairy tales having this sort of gruesome side to it, and these witches and terrible mothers or whatever they are in those stories, and that hurt children, and all of that. It seems as though part of the studies by Bettelheim and others suggest that is healthy, that the youngsters have to have a way of dealing with their dark side and with the scary forces of life, and sort of they get projected with these fairy tales, and they become somewhat manageable in a way. So Aristotle's catharsis notion and the way fairy tales work make me think that there is something in the human psyche that needs this purging periodically, that feelings can get pent up. There can be angers and resentments, and one looks for constructive ways, or at least non-destructive ways of releasing some of that. Maybe people use sports, spectator sports, to do that.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure I do. I was thinking of the issue of violence as a fan, and violence as a fan related to violence as the participant. And we think of the violent sports, football and the crunching. Personally, I abhor violence. One person beating up on another. And yet, somehow in football, it can be a high. And I'm not really sure about my own value system when that happens. I remember back to your Celtics and Jim Luskatoff. He was the first enforcer that I remember. And Jim Luskatoff was not one of my heroes because he was not graceful or skilled. He was just a bully, at least in my perception. Hockey violence.
Yeah, now that's one that really bothers me, I must say. I don't understand the world of hockey that well, and although when I see the slow motion films on TV, I appreciate their skills greatly. But that part of it has not made a lot of sense to me. The fighting that goes on in hockey, and
yet it seems to appeal once again to the fan who needs to cathart.
Yeah, I wonder.
Philadelphia, when they were Flyers, when they were known as the Broad Street Bullies, and they had so-called goons, the hockey equivalent of Jim Luskatoff. Their attendance, they were sold out for every game during that 3 or 4 year period, because fans could go there and know they would see blood and see some small, swift forward mashed against the boards by a couple of 220-pound defensemen that were slow, unskilled, but very hostile.
Slow but hostile, yes.
I remember the term Jake Gaither, when he coached Florida A&M football, said he looked for football players that were hostile, agile, and mobile.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah.
Yes.
That was attributed to Duffy Doherty, too, I think, at times. Those things go among the coaching ranks, I suppose. But so we've got this violence in sports. What we're really talking about is being a spectator of sports and what that does for us, or what that tells us about
ourselves. What that relieves and releases and tells us, about ourselves.
So the first thing we're looking at is this violence that's connected with sports. And, I mean, in some cases, it just is so out of line. I mean, when people are going to get almost beat up and killed and as a result of these soccer games and so on. I mean, I think almost everyone recognizes that's just out of line. I mean, it makes no sense, and it has to be something we have to do something about. Then we have more minor forms of that. I mean, we have people at baseball games drinking too heavily and using very coarse language, and parents not wanting to bring their children to those games to have to hear that. I think up in Detroit they had to close down the bleachers for a while because they were getting carried away in probably a little bit of beer drinking and so on. So there's degrees of this, and maybe at some point it becomes almost a necessary release. I mean, maybe you could imagine somebody who has a lot of frustration in them and is maybe in danger of hurting members of their family, if they can watch a pro football game on Sunday and get some of that violence out of them and feel more peaceful at the end of it and less likely to strike their children, I mean, I'd have to say, well, this is a good thing. This is a harmless kind of release or even a constructive catharsis that this person would have. Maybe pro football, which we know has this enormous popularity, does that for some people.
I could imagine so. I also, when I think of fans, have to think of the bright side, the exhilaration available to a fan, whether you're watching your television set or whether you're there in the stadium. And I remember my own experiences in the 60s with the Cleveland Browns being in the stadium. And I used to tell my first wife, and this may be why she was my first wife, that while I loved her dearly, Jimmy Brown had given me the biggest thrills in my life. And to be in Cleveland Stadium with 82,000 fans rooting for the Browns and having Jimmy Brown run through the line and knock over Sam Huff and go for a touchdown, the energy level, the pure exhilaration was orgasmic almost in terms of the power of it. All of us sharing that experience, yelling our lungs out. It's hard to imagine any comparable experience. Think of yourself at television. You didn't get to see all of the Detroit games when they beat the Cardinals for the World Series. How did you feel at home watching the games, the exhilaration?
Yeah. Oh, there's no doubt about it. But I think a distinction to make here is watching on television and being part of the crowd, because there really is a great crowd psychology involved in being part of something larger. That's got to be, when you see 14,000 fans at a basketball game going, we're number one, and so on, and just getting carried away. I mean, this is a phenomenon that has to be reckoned with. I mean, this is pulsating for people. It's passionate. There's something going on. And what I think your suggestion is that one feels part of something larger, that you're lifted out of yourself. It's like this team is carrying my banner, or my psyche's involved in all of this. And I really do think that's true. I watched a baseball game one time in a private enclosed box, and where you could not hear the crowd noises. And it was quite an experience, and it really lacked something.
Sterile almost.
Yes, right. I mean, at an air-conditioned place, and monitors where you could watch the TV, and food being served, and all of the things that you would associate with loving to be at the ball game, or the finer way of watching a ball game. But in a way, it is sterile. You don't have the crowd noises. You don't have the things that we associate with being shoulder to shoulder with people, and maybe hitting the person next to you and saying, this is great, and being carried away.
You become instant friends with everybody within 50 feet of you.
That physical thing. I remember being at a playoff game one time, and K-Line hit a single to left field, and I was there with my father, and I just, spontaneously reached over and started hitting him on the back and so on. As though, an interesting thing is the way you see players at the end of games, how they have to mob each other. I mean, at the end of baseball games, when the team wins the World Series or something, everyone runs out and jumps on a pile.
And it seems like a perfectly logical, rational thing to do. I mean, I want to jump out on the same pile myself. Do you remember when the Mets won their first league championship and all the turf was stripped off the field? And yet I can understand the fans wanting to retain a piece of that experience somehow in their memory. For some people, it could be the peak experience of their whole life.
I remember being at Yankee Stadium one time. It was the last game that Mickey Mantle played at Yankee Stadium, and I'm big on sort of seeing last games. And afterwards, because it was the last game, you were allowed to walk out in the field. And I remember going out in the field and standing at the shortstop position and just looking around. The stands were emptying out by then, and just thinking what it must be like for a youngster to come into Major Leagues and have 60,000 people sitting around this massive stadium and playing ball there. That sense of being connected in with all of that. And it's interesting, as we're talking about this, I get back to my opening remarks. I have to wonder how much of that is esoteric, or how much of that people can relate to. And I would think people in other areas of life probably find that same thrill. I mean, I wonder if our young people don't get a lot of that in rock music, being at a rock concert. I remember being at a concert one time with collegians and feeling some sense of that, of how they were caught up into it and how it lifted it out of themselves, and they were part of this larger group in some way. So, I mean, there are comparable experiences, so I don't think it is just speaking in an idiosyncratic way that people don't understand. I think there's some way of jumping in on that whole thing.
You mentioned when you were in New York last year that you went to see Fences, the Broadway show, and enjoyed it. Did you go with someone, or did you go on your own?
No, I went. That was an interesting experience. I went just by myself. I was celebrating the end of writing a chapter of a book, and I had some free time, and I ended up sitting with. It's a story about blacks, and right. Ended up sitting with a group of black women members of a Baptist church. And I was, the clear outsider in the midst of this group from many angles.
You were male, right?
That's right. White male Catholic sitting here. But it was one of the strong group experiences I can ever remember. The way these women identified with the woman character in the wife in the play, and the way they emoted, the way they responded verbally. And with sighs and so on. And while I was an outsider in the group, I could feel the power of this group getting involved in this play. I think it has something of that same character that you're talking about.
Exactly. Or the occasional time, if you hadn't had anybody to share that with or share the energy with, how you could have felt incomplete by the experience. The analogy to the stadium and the enclosed, air-conditioned, there was nobody to share that energy with. And yeah, I suspect people have the same phenomenon in rock concerts. I remember seeing Les Miserables on Broadway about a month after it opened, and the sheer exhilaration the audience felt, and how we sort of turned around and smiled at each other walking out. And there was a community, an instant community, built by sharing that experience.
And the sharing is also with the defeat side of things too. It seems sort of important to be around with all of that. I think of that the way, again, that can get carried away. I'm out of bounds myself in that. I think when the Celtics lose in the playoffs, I feel, and my statement is that there's something not right with the world at that point, that this isn't the right order of things is being violated. And I will feel that so deeply. Now, this part I don't, a lot of my sports reactions I understand psychologically, but I have no ties to the Boston Celtics. I root for Detroit teams mostly and so on. But for some reason, the Celtics are important to me, and I link it with the classic notion of teamwork that they have portrayed over the years.
There's a purity and a consistency and an integrity to the Celtics. Was any of that a response to their losing to the Lakers, do you think, or was it just exclusive to the Celtics losing? Period?
No, when they lose, period.
Okay.
And there's something wrong with that. But it's worse when they lose to Los Angeles, and
or lose to Detroit. Even in this particular case, there's a particular elegance the Celtics have always shown, going back to Bill Russell and Bob Cousy, which is not that available. Magic Johnson certainly is elegant, but Los Angeles and La La Land, it's hard for me to perceive a great deal of, well, what can I say without offending our people from Los Angeles? But let's just say that the Boston Celtics have a history of integrity and grace and style and teamwork.
Yeah, it's the teamwork phrase that catches on with me. But so the losing in the sports world is part of what one has to deal with, and that as a participant, one learns that because one loses a lot, and there's no way to avoid that.
And you learn a lot about yourself, or
that's right,
sometimes don't understand your particular reaction.
And there's that gets carried over then to the world of when you're a spectator. Now, there's this large involvement with the team, and there's a certain hurt when the team loses. Now, it would seem to me a rational person would keep a perspective on this. It doesn't seem rational to me to be terribly upset because the Celtics lose, or to feel that the right order of things is violated because it isn't. And it's not terribly rational to be depressed if your team loses. I mean, after all, it's only a game. And it's not life and death matters, So that my reason tells me that there's great overreaction in all of this. And yet you meet so many people whose mood will be dependent upon how their team is doing.
Oh, absolutely. Think of the Browns fans the last 2 years losing to Denver, and particularly this last year when they could have gone to the Super Bowl, and so many of us were ready to journey to San Diego or wherever and watch the Browns in the Super Bowl. It really checks out your view of reality very quickly. And it's hard not to be depressed or carry an affect of hopelessness and helplessness around.
I suppose if you weren't really involved, if you're really involved and really care about what happens, then you're bound to feel bad if it doesn't work out well, and you're bound to experience the exhilaration if it does. And if sports have a value, part of it is that it lifts us out of the ordinary, and it puts us into another time-space dimension, and suggests other things about life, that it teaches certain lessons, and none of that will happen if you're not passionate about it. So one could say that that becomes its value. We got enough blandness in life, and enough times when life is lived on a plateau. It's good perhaps to have these peak experiences at times, and to be lifted out of the humdrum and the ordinary. Let's go back to the question of the riots in Detroit. There's a lot of sociological speculation that the Tigers' good year in the midst of potential urban troubles helped to overcome that. That it siphoned off people's energy and gave them a cause, and brought people together in a way that other things weren't able to do. So, and people said, well, it helped to alleviate some of the tensions of urban life.
And that certainly is a possibility. As you know, there's a danger in correlating random activities and saying that they relate to each other when perhaps they do and perhaps they don't. You and I are obviously fanatical and fans together, and probably tend to justify our behaviors. I have leapt up off my living room couch when Kosar had a pass intercepted, and they ran back for a touchdown, and we lost, and I had screamed to high heaven and woke up my 5-year-old daughter upstairs. And I'm sure I found a justification for that, but that is bizarre behavior for an adult male who's supposed to be sane and rational.
There's no doubt this whole thing can get out of hand, as we've suggested, with the violence that occurs, but when you move it down to the personal level, it begins to say something about one's value system and what one treasures and so on. I mean, if pro football games are going to break up marriages, then we got to rethink the thing. I mean, if
how about if marriages are going to break up pro football fans? Yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be a tension between those two issues, Jim, in terms of one's sense of values.
Yeah, but we're still dealing with a game here.
Okay. I won't engage with that portion.
We need a perspective on the whole thing. I do think that those of us who love sports have to be aware of where we can get carried away. If I'm depressed because a team loses and it keeps me from preparing my homily well or something, well, I mean, that's wrong. I mean, I can't let that happen. I have to find a way to deal better with that. I have to come to terms with the sporting event or get it in some sort of perspective or something. In other words, if there's going to be destructive consequences, I think we have to try to find our way to overcome it.
I agree, and yet it has affected me. It will continue to affect me, and that is a world's reality. I suspect if, rather than just blocking out the experience, if I use that depression somehow, and I'm thinking of you in your homily talking about the experience and your response to it, and once again helping other people access their own depression.
That would be a constructive way of transforming it. I would agree with that. Now, that would be important
without
thing to do.
talking yourself out of the right to feel depressed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's no doubt that it's absorbing, and one has to deal with all of those consequences. I was thinking of the relationship between participating and being a spectator. Most of us who like to watch sports played them at one time or another and found our initial interest in that, although there's clear exceptions to that. I mean, I have friends who I know, weren't particularly into sports as they grew up and now have become really strong fans and have learned certain things about the game and really do enjoy it. And it's part of the cultural mix. It's part of what we talk about and binds us together in various ways. So, there's a danger, I think, where sports become just spectator matters and not participants. I think of women who, main job was to watch men play and didn't have their own opportunities to play themselves. Now, that was wrong, and we need to overcome it and are making progress in overcoming it. Maybe some people spend too much time in front of the TV set watching the game, or spend too much money going to the games and so on. And,
yes,
and not enough time walking themselves or doing some sort of athletic
I know two
thing.
cases in my own experience where the ESPN has broken up two marriages because the male of the house, as it happens, was watching Australian rugby at 2 a.m. in the morning because it was there. And
I often thought it was good that ESPN wasn't around when I was a kid.
Oh, exactly. I'd be more fanatical about more sports than I am now. It would be interesting to survey non-participant fans versus participant fans, just for level of energy, interest, enthusiasm, identification with particular heroes. It would be a good study for a doctoral dissertation in sports education or whatever.
Yeah, we're going to show that this world of sports isn't just frivolous. It's not just a game. It's worthy of the highest sort of academic
We're
consideration.
self-justifying again,
That's
aren't we?
right, yeah. We can easily get into that. Well, Ernie, we have been, I think, all over the lot with this discussion, which is all right. Sports rap often works like that. It breeds different ideas and so on. But we have been talking about sports and the whole question of being spectators, and one of my bits is that it's easy to get carried away and we ought to find some perspective on it so we don't end up being totally depressed when our team happens to lose.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Mr. Ernie Sibley, who is a local businessman and teacher. The topic of this week's Reflections was sports and fanaticism. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.